Sí, vas a tener.
It's a funny angle. But that is
Ahora después de 3 minutos.
global marketing chat.
Really?
Hopefully we'll get more communication.
Yeah.
So we need to, are you talking to Tracy?
No.
We need to connect you up.
That's a good starting point.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm trying to get us all connected up better, but...
No, to be honest, it's Nathan and Laura who's on my side.
They should be communicating directly, but I suspect our market's actually one copy. And we're trying to say, let's stop doing things inside.
Right, yeah, that's it.
So, we're trying to say, listen, if we're going to create content, you get it to you early enough, and also, and then I'll launch at the same time.
Yeah, I've seen it between the US and UK team. That we as Latin America, we tend to gravitate around certain guys or certain content. Yeah, it would be nice to have full force forward.
There's going to be one.
That should be one.
There's going to be one, that's the goal.
So yeah,
I'll make sure they add you to all communication.
happy to join the bus.
So this supposed to be every 2 weeks. Okay.
Hola, comenzamos. Salve. Sentate. Comportate, Charlie. Bueno, bienvenidos a todos. Gracias por estar acá y por tomar unas horas de su tiempo de trabajo para acompañarnos. Faltan algunas personas todavía por sumarse, así que vamos a estar recibiendo en el medio. Queríamos darles la bienvenida y quería contarles un poco cuál es el objetivo de esta reunión, ¿no? Primero que nada, el estilo trata de ser súper informal, o sea, siéntanse como en su casa, de interrumpir cuando quieran interrumpir. La idea es que sea de valor para ustedes, sea de valor para todos los que estamos acá. ¿Cómo le ponemos al evento? Entonces, ¿por qué le ponemos Learning Day? Porque es un día para que ustedes, que son todos profesionales de Learning and Development, se sienten acá, conozcan qué están haciendo otros también, es un momento de networking, compartir experiencias, y es como el espíritu de esto, ¿no? Ahora más adelante voy a presentarles a Steve, que nos acompaña. Steve nos va a dar su charla en inglés, así que vamos a hacer un switch en un momento. Steve es una persona con mucha experiencia en esto, tiene 20 años trabajando en este mundo del aprendizaje digital y todo lo que es aprendizaje. Ahora les voy a contar un poco cuál es su background. Anuncios parroquiales, por cosas logísticas, nuestros compañeros de la oficina, los de señoritas están arriba y los de señoritos están abajo. Así que las señoritas van a tener que ir a conocer la oficina. Está arriba. Otra cosa, no sé, Martín, logística.
No, realmente vamos a hacer como un lunch de mediodía. La parte más importante probablemente es compartir, realmente intercambiar información, tendencias. Y a la tarde la idea es ser más interactivos. Vamos a seguir rotando las mesas, hablando sobre las tendencias. Que tenemos la suerte de tenerlo a Steve, que va a darnos la mirada global. Él viaja muchísimo por todos los mercados. Así que tenemos un asiento en primera fila a lo que se viene en e-learning.
En cuanto a agenda, lo que vamos a hacer es ahora, vamos a tener la charla de Steve por la mañana, que lo que va a intentar hablar acerca de dónde él ve que viene el mundo del aprendizaje digital. Luego después vamos a tener la presentación de 3 casos, que son 3 ejemplos que todos ustedes van a presentar. Luego tenemos un break. Y a la tarde lo que vamos a hacer es que todas las tendencias que surjan en la mañana, más las que ustedes quieran sumar, las vamos a trabajar en 4 o 5 mesas redondas, una metodología que se llama World Café, que se lo vamos a explicar en profundidad en la tarde, pero es como una forma de polinizar ideas, como vamos a hacer un facilitador por cada mesa de entre nosotros, se van a dar unas preguntas disparadoras por cada tema, y vamos a ir rotando. O sea, al final lo que vamos a tener es que todos vamos a haber contribuido en cada tema, en cada mesa, y eso es lo que vamos a hacer, pues compilar un reporte y mandárselo a ustedes también. Y por eso es importante que ustedes traigan un tema en la cabeza relacionado con esto, que lo sumen después, vamos a votar todos los que estamos acá para ver cuáles son los temas que ponemos en las mesas. Así lo hacemos lo más two-way posible, ¿no? Y después de esto se acabó el día. Trataremos de terminar alrededor de las 4 de la tarde para que ustedes puedan regresar tranquilamente a contestar mails probablemente a sus oficinas, o pueden quedarse acá, son mails y más fácil. Traemos una cerveza, que son mesas de cervecería.
Observándonos, tienen a todo el equipo de Kineo de producción, no los había visto llegar. Son el motor atrás de básicamente todo lo que hacemos.
So I'm going to switch to English. I'm going to introduce you to Steve. Steve Lowenthal is the US CEO for Kineo and has the responsibility for all functions of the US operations. He joined Kineo in 2009, 10 years ago. They are celebrating their birthday, and helped oversee the growth in the US organization from a startup to 40 people now and many clients. Steve has more than 20 years of leadership, business development, and consulting experience, and has a proven track record of growing organizations and developing and deploying successful learning solutions across a spectrum of markets to improve performance and drive business results. Steve's career accomplishments include helping organizations mitigate legal, compliance, and ethical risks through structural education and communication at SAI Global, challenging chief learning officers at the nation's top teaching hospitals to expand the use of e-learning and the sharing of knowledge to raise the standard of care at University Health Consortium, championing e-learning simulation as a means to accelerate the learning curve with e-learning pioneer Roger Shank at Cognitive Arts, and helping Fortune 500 companies prepare managers for international relocation and business travel in Berlitz. Steve is really passionate about learning design and helping companies and bringing solutions and solving problems. So I really, let's proceed with applause.
Good morning and thank you. Thank you for welcoming me here and for, I apologize that while I worked for Berlitz for 7 years, I didn't learn Spanish. I was at Berlitz. French was my second language, so not very helpful, it turns out, at this point. So what I want to do today is just really share some of my observations and thoughts about the industry. I would start out by saying, I've been doing this, I've been involved in the industry for about 20 years, primarily on the learning technology side of things. And I'm as optimistic as I've ever been about the industry. I think if you look at the last 20 years of our industry, we've been through a lot. We tend to chase the next trend a lot as an industry. But I think we finally maybe have come to a point where we're kind of taking a much more holistic view of how we solution and we approach employee development. And so I'll talk a little bit about that today as I work through this. And please just interrupt me as I go, ask questions. I'll ask you some questions as we move through it, but it's, please make it a dialogue, not a lecture. So the first big change I see going on, this is probably the one that's impacting the industry most, is that we're seeing talent development really start to take over the learning and development world as being the primary driver of training. So I think it's not an either or, it's an and. So many of us, myself included, so we're now looking at how do we develop those skills. It also brings some challenges in terms of where expertise comes from. So we talk about subject matter experts and leveraging internal resources more often than not, but more and more we're starting to look outside of the organization to understand, to get that expertise. And finally is, we had internal measures for a lot of around how we measure progress of our programs, but again, when we don't have those skill sets in-house, we're starting to look outside and look at credentials from third parties for that evaluation. So I'll touch on each of those a little bit. Just some statistics about some of the challenges we face as organizations. This is what CEOs and business leaders are saying, which is that more than half of people require significant reskilling to do their jobs. 90% of people are saying that their organizations are redesigning jobs currently, and only 1 in 10 organizations have the skills it needs to be successful. So those are some disturbing statistics if you think about our roles in the organization. It makes our roles more important, is the good news. So we have to start thinking again about what are the tools available to us to decide how we're going to create our training plans for any given year as we look forward 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. So historically, organizations that we've worked with have had training cycles, right? So they go out and meet with the different business leaders. What skills do you need? Those tools are starting to fall short from a talent development lens. So we have to start looking at outside data. And this is relatively immature data, but growing organizations like our parent company, Citi and Guilds, are starting to invest heavily in starting to understand specific industries and specific skills gaps in those industries, and starting to think about how do we help bring people into industries to fill those skills gaps. So there's different tools out there, right? There's economic reports that you can see. Large consulting firms will tend to do sector studies. We can do surveys of our own employers, and we can do qualitative or primary research to find those things. And as I think one of our challenges is how do you bring all those together, and how do you actually really find detailed data to support your strategy and plans? So, just a couple examples. I believe this is out of an energy source, but just starting to look at how people are starting to categorize skills gaps within an industry like oil and gas. And this is an industry, I'm not sure the details are particularly important, but what you see is that as people are starting to deep dive into this analysis, that skills gaps becomes quite apparent that these are industries that need to grow and change, yet they don't have the talent to drive that growth and change. Manufacturing is a similar story as the manufacturing world continues to automate. How do you reskill that? In the U.S. economy, we feel that quite a bit, which is, it's this, we have full employment basically in the U.S., yet we have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of jobs unfilled. And that's that gap in terms of the available labor and the skills that people need. Here's a survey from LinkedIn that starts to point out, what are the skills we need? And if you look in your organizations, some of these skills you may have available today, and there's people you can upskill. But I think there's an awful lot of things on here: game development, scientific computing. These are gaps that they just don't. They're not available today. So we have to start thinking about how do we bring these skills into the organization? And as organizations face that challenge, I think that the practices start to change, and things like we're starting to look outside of the organization for expertise and development resources. So one of the things you're seeing is a growth in executive education in our market. I'm curious if that's true here, where people are tapping into the university systems. More and more executive education is changing quite dramatically to focus take less of an academic focus and take much more of a how do we help organizations grow their talent base. The other big change, obviously, is MOOCs, which are extensions of universities often. And how do we start giving people access to that knowledge, to those experiences? Are organizations here using MOOCs and bringing them in-house more and more?
Yeah, a lot.
A lot. I mean, I use them, right? So I mean, I find it as a self-motivated, you know, someone who wants to learn and increase my skills. Where do you turn for this? And MOOCs are a great source of sort of quick tutorials on different skill sets. The last piece of what we're seeing is credentialing. So Kineo, our parent company, City & Guilds, has invested in a company called Credly, which is a digital credentialing company. And so the idea is that as we start to need more skills, how do we find those skills outside of our organization? So digital credentials are a way to start to create a digital resume, if you will. So if you go on LinkedIn, we'll start to see more transparency about what skills people have, where they've acquired those skills, and what sort of the detail behind those skills. So we think digital credentials are sort of at just the beginning of something that's going to become quite significant in terms of how do we recruit the right talent into our organizations and find those new skills. So let me pause there and see if you have questions for me about any of that. I'll ask you some questions. Are your organizations starting to look at skills forecasting? What are some of the best practices you've started to put in place? And I think it's important you guys learning from each other is more important than learning from me. Is this something your organizations are actively trying to tackle?
Trying to do.
Don't be shy.
Conversation about that.
In my case, it's very different because I work in Natura, but I'm working is commercial. It's a commercial learning because I don't work for the people in Natura. I work for the people who sell the.
Awesome.
Yeah, and it's very different because I have a lot of experience. I have like people who didn't finish the college and people who have a title in the university or something like that. So it's very different. In my case, it's a challenge to learn how to educate these people, yeah. So it's very different. I don't know in your cases, guys, what do you have in your companies?
Are you finding that there are talent shortages in your organizations? Are there similar challenges to the U.S. right now where you have low unemployment in Argentina or high unemployment? So, but do you find that you have jobs that you want to fill that you can't fill? Is that common in your organizations?
Yes, it's common. But I think that probably companies are not still doing that here. I mean, trying to see the future in terms of skills. More like they are fighting fires.
Fighting fires. Well, that's okay. So let me move on and talk a little bit about just sort of the changing landscape of learning technology. So this is one of my clients, Dropbox, loves this phrase, frictionless learning. So that's their goal as they look at their learning ecosystem that they're trying to put in place. I don't know if that's a term. So learning ecosystem is sort of the new big term in learning technologies. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means, but it's created a much more complicated landscape for all of us to navigate. So 20 years in this industry, it's been a fairly sleepy industry. If you look at learning and development, underinvested in historically, probably sort of relegated to the back of the line within the corporate hierarchy. And over the last few years, investments are really good vision of that. Things have changed quite dramatically. I guess in my personal theory or interpretation of this is a lot of, as the higher ed space started to transform in the US and globally, lots of venture capitalists decided let's go try to be a player in the higher ed space, in the ed tech space. So a lot of investment was made to transform the university experience and the extension of universities. What they found, unfortunately, that's a very difficult place to generate revenue. So what has happened is a lot of that technology has transitioned from the higher ed space into the corporate learning space. So the corporate learning space is now the beneficiary of that, and you know, we've seen dramatic change in terms of the technology available to us and the complexity of the environments we're trying to navigate through. So, you know, it looks a little bit like this. We've got, you know, virtual reality, we've got e-learning, we've got micro-learning, we've got knowledge-based community simulation, and on, right? So it used to be the LMS. Where do you go for learning? Well, you send everybody to your learning management system. Today, it's you know, learning has become a much broader definition. So I think we all realize that you know, corporate knowledge systems like SharePoint are learning. Community sites are learning, and people are learning from all of these different places. But then the challenge becomes: do I ask people to go look in 3, 4, 5, 6 different places to find learning resources? And you know, this is my interpretation of what that can look like from a user experience point of view. And you know, there are just some statistics from the web, you know, more the consumer space about how people experience the web. But you know, I think we feel this pain within our organizations today, which is if people can't find what they're looking for, they leave, right, in the marketing world. If they have a bad experience, they go away. So we have to think of our learners as consumers. So if they come try to find learning and they can't find it, or you have them start in one place and click something and then suddenly there's 6 windows open on my desktop, they're going to go away and they're not going to come back. So we have to, you know, one of the things we're doing is we're trying to figure out how to make these things more frictionless or easy to use. So you know, we've moved from this single source LMS to defining best-in-breed technologies. We've moved from standalone systems to how do we integrate all of these systems together to create a single user interface. We've gone from let's search in one place to search across many places so we find resources easily. We've moved from, you know, sort of event-based or learning activities to how do we stitch together different kind of learning experiences, participating in a forum, downloading a document, taking an e-learning course, attending an instructor-led training course to create learning pathways. And how do we as learning professionals help people navigate that? And we've changed from, you know, kind of reports that focus on consumption to how do we start to look at learning analytics? How do we understand how people interact and consume our learning resources? How does that reflect back on the business and performance? And you know, all of this is a fairly new, and we're all navigating it. This is a site I'm going to open up really quick, which we've used to benchmark some technology we currently have in development. And the idea here is that if you look at it, you know, they've taken these are all standalone systems sitting behind it. They have a community site, a knowledge base. They have their academy, which is, I believe, their LMS. They have a certification site. They have a document repository for their developers. They have access to their support team through a ticketing system. And then they have access to their website. They have search that you can search across all of those systems. So there's, you know, seamless navigation across these systems. There's dashboards which sometimes aggregate data from different systems, so you can see what's the last thing I visited, whether it be from, you know, your LMS or your community or your knowledge base. More and more we're starting to see tools like recommendation engines which say, based on what you've done, here's some things you might want to look at. And we think, you know, this is the kinds of solutions that we need to get in place in organizations so we can make learning seamless or frictionless for people. Navigate back without doing something bad. So that's a pretty picture on the front end. This is what the back end looks like when you start to try to achieve that. So as we work with organizations, we're starting to see more and more technology solutions that look like this. So, you know, without going into this too much, you see the different input systems in here. You see things like Lynda, you see your virtual instructor-led platform, you see your LMS. You start to build data warehouses or data lakes, where we're aggregating that data on the back end, and you start to see front ends, like the piece I just shared with you, where we try to take all of that data, all of those different learning experiences, and have it make sense for that end user. So this is sort of the future of, you know, what we're facing as learning and development departments. How do we actually create these fairly complex systems and make sense of them?
Is that what you call the learning ecosystem? Like
This is an example. It's a technology architecture for a learning ecosystem designed for a client. So just curious, where are all of you in terms of learning technology? Are you starting to find that you're introducing, you have more than one technology? Does everybody have an LMS in place? And you virtual instructor-led training, or more and more, WebEx, Adobe products. Do you have communities? Is social learning communities part of that?
We are right now transitioning from a very poor LMS structure to another one. I don't know if it's going to be much better, but it will enable us to host there and more modern products. So we are in the middle of the transition right now towards
It's always better.
something that and we are in the state business, so we are, I mean, I feel we are reflecting in the model you've shown, the factories transitioning. We have to, the skills are changing radically, so we are right now working on that.
So the next sort of observation, this will probably be maybe closer to some of the day-to-day work you do, is just start thinking about, the analogy I like to make is to marketing. So if you think, there's a famous quote from a guy named John Wanamaker, who used to say, half of the advertising is works, I just don't know which half. and learning, I think, is trying to make that exact same transition, right? It's taken a long time, but we're starting to mature our practices to become very outcome-oriented versus content-oriented. So talk a little bit about what that, this is what our executives are telling us, which is they care about learning. They want to see increasing performance metrics first and foremost. Business outcomes are what they want people to talk about. So one of the things learning people often complain about is they don't get access, a seat at the table. I'm not part of projects when they get initiated. Training is an afterthought. So if we want that seat at the table, this data point tells us we have to talk about business outcomes with our customers, with our internal customers. The problem is we're not getting there, right? So executives believe in training, they want to see business outcomes, but when you sort of, the hard light of day, when you ask them, do you think we're doing the job, and they quarter of them think we are. So it's important that we start to make some changes to do that. So some of those things are start thinking about moving from content to outcomes, right? As an industry, we talk about this word content. We build content. We should say, well, we create outcomes. We don't build content. We tend to think very much in terms of events. So if you think about our history, a lot of us were creating instructor-led training, or our primary delivery method was instructor-led training, so it's very event-based. You come to a class, you move on. In the learning technology space, we've kind of repeated that model. You take an e-learning, you move on. We don't think about what happens next, but how do we start thinking about integrating those experiences together? We also think, again, we deliver once and don't think about it versus we deliver once and then measure and improve and continue to change. And then we think about data. How do we need to think about what data do we need to be successful doing this? So just a common mistake is, again, is focus on content rather than thinking about the set of effective and engaging experiences we need to create to address a business need. ADDIE, which we all raise our hand and swear by often, is very a content-focused process, right? So I found this version online, but it talks about design customized content, develop a course material. It doesn't talk about outcomes. It doesn't talk about making a business impact. It's very much focused on how do we design that piece of content, whether it be instructor-led or online. And I think our business is starting to mature away from that. So part of our process here is thinking about this, going through like a five-step design process, which I'll go through relatively quickly with you. But start out by start with the end in mind. So what's the business outcome you're trying to accomplish? So as we go through design workshops, we start out by saying, why are you doing this? What's going to happen if you don't do it? How do we measure that, right? So if we're successful, what happens? And it's important, I think we always try to do that in the broadest context possible, because learning alone may not make that difference, but we think learning is often part of a set of initiatives that an organization is taking on. So we want to be clear about how we're successful and how we're going to measure success. Next is our audience, right? So if you focus on content, that's okay, but at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is get people to start, stop, and continue doing things. So we have to take a really deep dive in terms of understanding who our audience is. And to do that, we use personas to do that. We sort of, again, take a page out of the marketing world. We get very specific. We say, who is this person? What's their background? What are the blockers and barriers to making the changes that we're seeking to do? And they really become the primary filter that we use as we go through the design process. Because at the end of the day, our content is important, but we want, President Mary to do something different. And really, as we design the set of experiences that are going to do, as we create training, it's really about designing experiences to get Mary to change or to do something new. The next step is, we kind of think of this as the Holy Trinity. We know our business outcome, we know our audience, and then we start to document what does that person need to do, right? So we try to get very concrete through that process and say, well, if we want Mary, in this case, Mary was an audience in an association of fire chiefs that we developed training for. We want Mary to be more effective operationally. But Mary is a volunteer, it turns out, and she works in a small town. She doesn't have a lot of background in the operation of the fire department. She's doing this out of goodwill. So what are the specific things Mary needs to do, and what help does Mary need to make that change? So we go through that process. Are people familiar with Kathy Moore, action mapping? So action mapping is one of the techniques we use, and it's a visual way to kind of take you through that process I just mentioned. So you start out, what are your goals, and then each of these green dots is sort of the actions Mary would need to take, the specific behaviors we need to see to achieve that goal. And then you think about what content or knowledge would Mary need to enable her to take that action. So one of the important things about this, we find, and I'm curious if you find the same, is if you ask a subject matter expert about content, they always have a lot of it. There's never a shortage of content. They're experts, they're happy to tell you about it. But learning is often about it's about what you don't teach as much as what you do teach. And going through this exercise really helps us put constraints around a training solution. Because what we find the opposite is if you say we want to create an hour of training, but we have 3 hours of content, and I'm not negotiable on that, what do you end up with? You don't end up with a very engaging, effective experience. So paring it back becomes pretty important. We also need to just understand constraints. Budget constraints, logistical constraints, technology constraints. We have to collect that into the process to make sure we're designing the right solution. And then we need to envision that experience and really, we want to take a very broad view of what that experience is, and we think, we use the term blended learning. I always think of the blends from a functional point of view and a technology point of view. So there's different purposes that you're creating training. I'll walk through these each real quickly. So you know, sometimes we just need to engage people, right? So we're doing it to capture hearts and minds. So a lot of compliance training. It's not rocket science to say change your password every 2 weeks. But it's a hard thing for people to remember to do. Or if you're in the healthcare space, you know how many e-learning courses have been done on hand washing. And again, these aren't particularly difficult skills, but we need to convince people to do them. So sometimes we just need to engage people and motivate people to do that. Sometimes people aren't even aware of their own shortcomings, right? We create a beautiful piece of learning, yet people don't know they need that learning. They think they're good at what they do today already. So we want to, you know, up front do some sort of diagnostic so people understand what's my current skill set. So that can be a knowledge-based diagnostic. Often it's an observational diagnostic. Have a manager take them through a checklist and understand how well they do today. So we need to kind of open people to learning and let them know they have a gap. This is where we spend most of our time today as learning developers, is you know, giving people experiences to learn new material and skills. Then we sometimes forget that a lot of the things we teach in a classroom or online, I'm not ready to put them into practice, right? In the extreme, if someone said in a classroom to learn to fly a plane, would you put them behind the stick of a plane? The next day you probably wouldn't, right? But a lot of our skills, if you think about selling skills, if you think about coaching skills, you can go through a half-a-day session on coaching, you're probably not ready to coach. So we need to give people deliberate practice. So we need to put scaffolding around that practice. If you go out and coach, and then maybe you come back and have an expert that you can share your experience with and talk about what worked, what didn't work. Or if you're selling, maybe you drive with somebody, you get joined by a mentor or a manager on that sales call to give you feedback. And it takes people often 3-4 times of deliberate practice to start to build that skill. Finally is assessment. You know, obviously lots of different ways we can assess people. Again, we can assess progress, we can assess confidence in terms of doing things, and we find both of those to be important. Last thing is just reinforcement. So a lot of what we do, sometimes information changes, so we need to put in place tools and methodology, processes to continue to update people. Sometimes they just forget to do things. We'll go back to the password. We may convince them to do that password, but if we don't send an email every 2 weeks saying, hey, your passwords are getting stale, it's probably time to change it again. And these can be very simple things, or they can be more complex, but online performance support kind of solutions. So you know, when we come out of the design process, it's important to think that every learning journey is different. And again, that's the purpose of our design process. So you know, how do you balance things out will vary quite significantly based on the audience, the topic you're teaching, the organization, and the culture. Next thing is just to think about, you know, once we put a learning pathway in place, we now have some metrics about why we're doing this. Here's our solution. We need to start thinking more agile about how we support learning in the field. So, you know, kind of a traditional waterfall approach. We build it, it's done, and we move on to the next project. We're all under a lot of pressure to do that. But ideally, we stay engaged with the business, right? If we really want to be of value to the business, we design something to solve a problem. We're measuring the impact, how we're doing against that. Turns out we got some things right, we got some things wrong. How do we now go back and improve that over time? So data is obviously an important tool to that. So most of us have focused most of our energy around what I would call consumption data in the learning space. So how many people enrolled, how many people completed it, how frequently do they come back to the LMS? You know, I think we're starting to, you know, branch out in the learning space and start thinking about business metrics. So how does consumption data compare to business metrics? And that's where data analytics and sort of this idea of big data start to enter into our industry. And we can also do a lot more around skills assessment. So we can measure how confident people are in not only their knowledge, but how confident they are in their knowledge. As they progress through a learning program over time, we can continue to collect that data. And I think ultimately our role is to measure all of these and start to bring in talent on data input and data analytics and data assessment to figure out how they relate to each other. So I guess my time to ask you guys questions again. So are you finding your processes are changing? Are you finding different demands from your organization? Are you finding that business people are seeing training as a more strategic part of their planning process?
Si se sienten más cómodos en español, igual le traducimos el estilo, o sea, para participar ahí en cuestión. No, I'm telling them if they're more comfortable saying Spanish, no French.
Not so much?
No, I think until I want to talk in Spanish. Tomo tu oferta. Pero me parece que es muy difícil aislar las variables vinculadas con el entrenamiento y ver cómo impactan en el negocio. Entonces me parece que hasta que no se descubra un método de evaluación que permita demostrar de forma efectiva cuál es el impacto, va a ser como muy difícil el cambio. Mientras tanto nos vamos haciendo como el lugar.
As you say, that it's very difficult to find the variables to take, like extract the data and make it impactful to evaluate the real impact of those.
Yeah, I think we're finding in some areas easier than others. We do a lot of work in customer education, for example. So that's an area that data is a little simpler to navigate because we know the metrics. In a software as a service world, it's churn. How many people leave? That's